You have watched the videos and you have felt something between curiosity and recoil, and now listen closely because the first truth is the hardest to hold. This is not a claim of cruelty but a map of risk drawn from years of unattended harm and slow institutional failure. In a small house in odd West Virginia, routines were the anchor of lived meaning, and when those routines were broken, the most vulnerable were exposed to threats they could not name or fight. Before the cameras arrived, there were incidents that read like warnings when repeated enough times to form a pattern. People with limited understanding became targets for opportunists and for acquaintances who moved between kindness and violence with alarming ease. When a protective order is requested and then allowed to lapse, the document itself becomes a brutal promise rather than a shield. Think about that legal lapse as a portal through which past aggressors returned, and in that return the risk to those who cannot fully comprehend danger increased dramatically. This section will lead you through the evidence that convinced social workers to act and why removal from a house full of history and tenderness became a necessary intervention. Do not mistake the word removal for abandonment. It is a repositioning of duty, a legal substitution for failed guardianship. Imagine waking to someone you do not trust in the same room and not having the words to tell a police officer what happened. Imagine being unable to remember where your money went or to argue with a stranger who claims to be a friend with keys to your life. This is the calculus that shifted the balance toward protective custody. The state in this moment is not an enemy but an instrument designed to remove immediate threat and to create distance between vulnerable lives and the men who by pattern had proven dangerous. We will show you the reports, the eyewitness accounts, and the corroborated incidents that together formed a case strong enough to compel action. Listen as a mentor would and accept that sometimes protection means enforced separation, and that enforced separation can be the difference between injury and continued life. Hold that discomfort and let it shape your judgment about protection and responsibility moving forward today. Now, when officials read those reports and saw repeated vulnerabilities, they had to weigh the household autonomy against the duty to protect people who cannot protect themselves. The decision to place adults into protective custody is based on concrete evidence of ongoing danger and on patterns that predict future harm. It is a legal instrument intended to halt immediate threats and to begin stabilization with oversight and documentation. If you are listening, take this as a frame and prepare to follow the detailed evidence that informs each decision. The second truth exposes the physical environment that undermined care and that made even the kindest intentions implode. The house had been a repository of neglect, a place where structural decay and filth accumulated in layers like a slow chemical erosion of dignity. After the fire, their options narrowed and survival became an exercise in triage, with broken plumbing, intermittent heat, and no reliable sanitation. Living without consistent running water is not an abstraction, it is a daily threat to health and to the ability of caregivers to maintain hygiene and medication schedules. Clutter and accumulated waste are not merely ugly, they are vectors for infection and for accidents that can cause falls and lasting injury. Imagine navigating narrow pathways between stacked boxes while carrying a frail relative to the bathroom through an interior that was never designed for safety. Neighbors and journalists described squalor with terms that sound clinical but which translate in practice into risk of skin infections, respiratory problems, and chronic disease. These conditions are not temporary, they are chronic, and they compound age-related decline and cognitive impairment. When the state evaluates living spaces, it looks for patterns, not single visits, and what it saw in the Whittaker home met the threshold for intervention. A key distinction to understand is the difference between poverty and dangerous neglect. Poverty can be remedied with resources. Neglect is an ongoing failure of basic duty that creates predictable harm. When adults are unable to maintain cleanliness and structural repairs, the environment itself becomes a predator and not a backdrop. In state care, the first difference is consistent sanitation and oversight, with trained staff ensuring medication is stored safely and that food is prepared under hygienic conditions. Locked entrances and visitor screening stop strangers from bringing additional risks through the door, and regulated facilities are obligated to provide minimum standards that a patchwork household cannot. Acceptance of aid is not shame, it is life preservation. In this section will show how the physical realities of the house presented immediate hazards to medical stability and to personal safety. We will describe documented inspections, the photographs taken by investigators, and the lists of repairs that went undone for years in plain sight, and we will let the reader imagine the cumulative effect of daily exposure to such conditions. Hold the image of the house in your mind and use it to measure what safety truly requires today. Now, the third truth pulls back the human face of disability and explains why professional oversight mattered more than familiar presence. Ray, Timmy and Lorraine are not eccentric, they are dependent, and their conditions require clinical observation, structured schedules and trained intervention. What looks like simple confusion to a passerby can be a signal of infection, internal injury, dehydration, or serious medication mismanagement. A professional care team watches for small shifts in skin tone, unexplained weight loss, changes in mobility, and alterations in mood that precede medical emergencies. Timmy may present with the innocence of a child, but his physical vulnerability is adult scale, and that mismatch complicates caregiving tasks in ways that exhaust untrained relatives. Daily routines that include accurate dosing of medication, timely meals, and consistent mobility support are the foundation of health for people with significant needs. Without these routines, risk multiplies, and a single missed dose or a single unattended fall can cascade into hospitalization and into loss of function. State facilities are imperfect, but they operate under regulatory requirements, staffed by nurses and aides whose job is to observe, to record, and to escalate concerns when patterns emerge. Documentation matters because it creates a legal trail that protects vulnerable adults from invisible harm and that forces transparency into decisions about care and resources. When a caregiver ages or becomes sick, their ability to compensate declines, and the margin for error disappears into practical threats to life and dignity. This section will examine medical records, court filings, and first-person testimony that reveal the gulf between ad hoc family care and structured professional oversight. We will also show why monitoring for mental health decline and for cognitive deterioration is as important as fixing a broken step or replacing a leaky pipe. What saved lives in similar cases was not removal alone, but the combination of safe housing, medical monitoring, and accountable record keeping that makes neglect visible and actionable. If you have watched without judgment up to now, use that same restraint to understand that everyday acts of nursing are quite heroic, and also that heroism cannot replace systems, and that systems exist to prevent avoidable loss. Remember that skill matters and that love without training is vulnerable to unseen failure. Join the call for sustained care, insist on regular audits, and demand that vulnerable people receive consistent professional attention across time. Today, now please, this is the pivot point in our descent and the moment where witness must become a practice rather than a passive act. You have listened, and now you are expected to respond with a small ritual that requires no money and that can shift algorithmic attention toward compassion. At this moment, take a public stand and type the phrase "I am seen" twice in the comments with no additions and nothing else. Type 1 "I am seen" twice to register your witness and to signal that you will not turn suffering into entertainment. This small public repetition has two functions. It creates a digital marker of empathy, and it trains the platform to register a different kind of engagement than crude curiosity. Rituals alter habit and habit shapes culture, so perform the act and then consider what practical steps follow. Individual witnessing without action will not change structures. After you have commented, review the harm that surrounded the family, the violent returns, the lapses of protection, and the chaotic swirl of donations and opportunists. Consider how viral attention can create more danger by publishing addresses, by creating crowds, and by turning vulnerability into content. Ask yourself what responsibility means when the faces you watched are people with limited means to consent to exposure and with limited power to demand restitution. This section will lay out the timeline of harassment, the documented threats, and the moments when outside curiosity turned into trespass and when trespass escalated into danger. Understand that the act of commenting is symbolic but also practical if it redirects attention and if it is followed by pressure that demands audits and accountability. If you perform the ritual, then take another small step: share resources, demand information from local officials, and refuse to engage in content that monetizes human harm. The heart of this pause is simple: witness followed by structured action. Witness alone appeases conscience, action secures safety and changes incentives. Do not underestimate the ripple effect of disciplined attention. Call local adult protective services if you suspect ongoing harm. Contact legal aid groups that monitor probate and donations, and support verified organizations that provide care rather than sending cash to unknown intermediaries. Refuse to share location information, refuse to visit their road, and refuse to film without consent. These practices protect privacy and reduce harm, and they translate digital witness into durable safety for the future. The fifth truth is the fire and the way it compressed lives into a smaller and harsher geometry of survival. Fire is a rupture that forces decisions into stark relief. It clears the comfortable illusion of continuity and replaces it with immediate scarcity. When a mobile home burned, the family lost more than structures. They lost the scaffolding of daily memory, the place where routines anchored identity and where the familiar faces of caretakers were immediate. 6 people and dogs squeezed into a trailer meant for far fewer, and the lessons of proximate crowding are simple and brutal. Sleep becomes contested, food distribution becomes a negotiation, and privacy disappears into a shared airspace where tensions accumulate and fray nerves. In such spaces, minor injuries become emergencies because there is no room to isolate illness and no easy way to summon assistance without disrupting the fragile choreography of day-to-day life. The charred remains of the prior home are a constant visual reminder of loss, and the daily presence of ruin shapes mood and choice in ways that are hard to quantify. Neighbors brought help intermittently, but goodwill without structural support cannot substitute for consistent resources, and the patchwork of aid left gaps that widened into danger. In the weeks after the fire, cameras found faces that bore a practiced endurance, not a tranquil acceptance but fatigue that accumulated into chronic strain. For people with cognitive limitations, the sudden relocation from known landmarks to institutional settings can be destabilizing, and yet the hazards of staying in squalor often outweighed the distress of change. This section will trace the immediate triage, the temporary solutions, and the long arc of recovery that requires measured investment and oversight, not viral sympathy. We will describe how daily tasks were reorganized, how children and adults learned to partition space, and how the smell of ash became a new background to every memory. Recovery is not a single act of rebuilding, it is a long, patient process of re-establishing routines, of securing consistent care, and of creating environments where dignity is possible again. If you witness this account, then do not confuse endurance with adequate support, and do not confuse images of calm with a resolution of risk. Act by supporting accountable charities, demand transparent reports, and refuse to glorify survival when survival is a fragile, unpaid labor today. Now, with steady, measured resolve, the sixth truth names the predators who treat misfortune as an opportunity and who understand the mechanics of extraction better than they understand care. When donations and attention flow unpredictably, the incentives for profiteering increase, and a legal shadow economy can form around vulnerable people. Invoices, affidavits, and probate filings can be weaponized by those who grasp how paperwork obscures theft under the cover of help. In the Whittaker case, evidence shows large sums raised publicly with only partial accounting, and with intermediaries who claimed authority without oversight. This is not always maliciousness by design. Sometimes it is sloppy management, and sometimes it is opportunism rationalized by proximity or by the belief that good intentions excuse bad practices. Yet the effect is the same: assets disappear from the lives of those they were meant to help, and that disappearance compounds risk rather than reducing it. Institutions that regulate fiduciary duty are often slow, and local authorities may lack the resources to audit informal charities and private managers who emerge around viral notoriety. We will trace the paper trails, the bank records, and the recorded statements that reveal discrepancies and that expose how lack of transparency creates fertile ground for abuse. When money flows through unregulated hands, there is little accountability and little recourse for people who cannot speak for themselves or who cannot demand receipts. In-state care funds intended for the three are handled through audited channels with mandated reporting and with legal obligations that prioritize beneficiary needs over promoter profit. This section will show how small-scale extraction compounds into systemic neglect and how legal reforms and community oversight can reduce opportunities for predation. It will also outline how to verify charities to whom you donate, how to document gifts, and how to insist on independent audits when large sums are raised for people who cannot manage finances alone. Start by asking for receipts, ask for audited statements, demand that funds be placed in court-supervised accounts, and insist on third-party oversight of spending. If you are a donor, request names of recipients and how money is spent. If you are local, join or form a watchdog group that can liaise with prosecutors and with adult protective services. Encourage whistleblowers to come forward, support them with legal aid, and push for probate reforms that close loopholes. Act publicly and insist on accountability every single time. The seventh truth is not an additional fact but a demand. It is an assignment of responsibility that arrives with knowledge and that refuses complacency. You have descended into a story that is both intimate and public, and now you must decide what to do with the knowledge, because knowledge without action calcifies into sentiment. First, admit that watching can harm and that consumption of vulnerability without follow-up is complicity. Second, convert outrage into sustained pressure by demanding audits supporting local care infrastructure and by refusing platforms that monetize human fragility. Third, protect and reward those who speak up by funding legal aid, by supporting witnesses, and by insisting that prosecutorial attention be given to credible claims of diversion and of neglect. Systemic reform matters, and it is granular. It asks for new rules at probate courts, for mandatory audits, for better oversight of online fundraising, and for clear chains of custody for donated funds. It also requires investment in rural health and in community-based supports that reduce the likelihood of concentrated burden on aging caregivers. Policy reform without community involvement will fail, so join local coalitions, insist on transparency, and help build support networks that make it possible for families to get help before crisis. Remember that true guardianship is not a moment, it is a practice, and practices are sustained by institutions' rules and by daily accountability. If you are willing to act, start small, make a call, write an email, attend a county meeting, support a verified direct care organization, and share policies that protect vulnerable adults. If you are a maker of content, stop profiling and start partnering with advocates who can convert attention into resources and oversight. This story was never meant to be a spectacle, it was meant to wake you to duty and to show that power measured by protection is the truest form of authority. Carry this knowledge and let it change the way you watch the world, let it change the way you respond to human need, and let it turn your curiosity into a lifetime of guardianship. Make a personal covenant today. Pledge to act when you see harm. Pledge to support audits. Pledge to refuse voyeuristic sharing and to support organizations that employ trained staff and to lobby for legislative closure of loopholes. Remember the names Timmy, Lorraine, Ray, and let them guide your measures.